Seth, this your brother is here, Osiris, who has been preserved alive and who lives that he may punish you. He lives. Utterance 219, line 173, Pyramid Text of Unis. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me this week. It's been a busy time since I last did an episode for you guys. Thankfully, though, the show is still, doing well, and I'm looking forward to putting this episode out. I appreciate all the support that we got for the last episode. So, it seemed to be very well received. Let's go ahead and continue on. I had been planning actually to just move on for the Egyptian stuff, but I did have a little bit of feedback and some questions, and I kind of wanted to expand on some of that and just do a little bit more with the Egyptian mythology stuff. In fact, this episode, depending on how long this takes, may end up being another part to the Egyptian thing. Although, if this does kind of stretch into next week, only a very brief part of that will be based on Egyptian mythology or Egyptian history, because at that point we need to finish the rest of North Africa before we move on to the Middle East, Southeast Asia, that area. I hope if you're new and you're picking up right now, you've dived into an interesting episode. And if you're a returning listener, as always, again, thank you so much. I mentioned it the last time. We may be kind of stretching what we're covering in the timeline, but there are some deep ideas and concepts about the nature of their world and their lives that are at least having their foundations laid by the Proto-Egyptian people, in my opinion, at the very least by the end of this season, and probably closer to the start of it. And to that end, I'm going to expand on a concept or goddess that I mentioned a little bit last episode, and this is Ma'at. And from there, I'm going to discuss the Egyptian captivation with death, or more of the afterlife, and the need for them to be prepared for that. And I'm also going to talk about the origins of, or at least what the Egyptians believed about the origins of their political makeup and authority. All of which, of course, are tied up together in some way or another. Though, before we start, I did want to make a point that I forgot to emphasize last episode. And that is, like many other people in the world, the Egyptians believed that the gods had their own origins and generations like men did. The collective myths and stories of these beginnings and genealogies of deities and all this kind of stuff is known as a theogony. And this word comes from the title of the Greek poet Hesiod's Theogonia, which is an account of the origins of the Greek gods. Now, what makes the Egyptians stand out to me as different from other peoples, or one of the things that make them different from the other peoples, is that the Egyptians made sure that their earliest primordial gods had at the very least a minor role, and some had much more important roles, but they at least had minor roles in their active worship and religious practices, which, as we will see when we move on to other areas, other people weren't always doing. So just that's one thing I think stands out about the Egyptians. For now, though, let's discuss one of these primordial deities, Ma'at. Now, in the earliest historical period, she's listed as a daughter of Ra, the sun god, or Re, depending on your pronunciation. Specifically, Re is the sun when it is at its highest point in the sky, bright, brightest, and the hottest. So it's midday, or the noon sun is what Re represents. Now, of course, he is the ruler of the gods, and in some stories, the creator of mankind. Again, depending on your version, he may or may not have created us, but he's in charge of the guy that did create us, essentially, regardless of what version of the story you're hearing. Now, Ma'at is a deity of order, harmony, truth, justice, civilization, and all the good things that those things bring, at least according to the Egyptians. Now, her name is used as kind of a watchword or a declaration a person makes to say that they have lived a good life or a pious life or a just life. They say that they had served Ma'at. And you see that a lot on a lot of, inscriptions, both in funeral areas or tombs. And then you also see them, written down as like proclamations of civic servants, pharaohs, those kind of things. Though in some cases it may be difficult to determine what aspect of Ma'at they actually served, or if they had just served the goddess herself. It's hard to tell in certain situations. Or what aspect of Ma'at they serving. Were they serving truth? Were they serving justice? Were they serving order? That kind of thing. Now, Ma'at is was typically depicted as a young woman, though depending on the era or role that she was being depicted in, she would be having a different iconography that identified her. In big dramatic scenes associated with important events or tying her into the royal power of Ra, she is typically shown with having brightly colored wings. Sometimes they take up her whole arms. Sometimes they are just under her arms, like she's, like trying to glide with feathers like that. These wings typically are, multicolored. They'll be red with gold trim, and then blue or green with, also with gold trim. And the reason that she had wings in this fashion is because, again, she is the daughter of Ra. And Ra is usually shown as a falcon or a falcon-headed man with a crown. And this crown has a golden cobra encircling a full sun, or the sun disk itself. This cobra is called the Uraeus. And it's in an upright position. Like, it may be circular, but the head is up like a cobra would be, like it was ready to strike if it needed to. Now, this could also, and it definitely was, it was a representative of the goddess Wajet, who is depicted almost always in a very similar way. And she's the patron goddess of the kingdom of Lower Egypt. But she was also a protective deity. Now, once you get into later periods, once writing has been invented and developed as a means of record keeping and communication, Ma'at was married to Thoth, who is the god of wisdom. Now, Thoth was the patron of scribes, and Ma'at, in her role as the goddess of truth, was a very good choice for his bride. And scribes were charged in both of their names to write wisdom and truth, respectively. And in these depictions, she is shown as being, again, a young woman, and that she has kind of a headband with a large, I think it's an ostrich feather is usually what it's described as, though it may not quite be that large in certain situations, but it's always just one feather standing upright. And of course, these are not exclusive descriptions. Like, sometimes she was depicted in both ways at the same periods, and sometimes different ways, different periods. Now, another thing that separates Egyptian religion from other contemporary religions, and even a lot of later ones, is that it is a dualistic faith. And there is good and there is evil. The Egyptians didn't have quite this sharp of a distinction, at least at the earliest periods. But instead there was order and chaos, and both had goods and both had ills, though they believed that order produced far more goods than chaos did, and far fewer ills than chaos did, or at least the same amount. Ma'at is the goddess of the goods that order brings. And indeed, she was believed to have created the goods of order to help support her father, Re. Now, the opposite of Ma'at, and this is the concept of Ma'at, not the goddess Ma'at, was Isfet. And this was chaos, the violence, destruction, just like random, destruction, not like planned in war. So this is like natural chaos. Now, Isfet was not a god or a goddess, at least that we're aware of, though the ultimate manifestation or avatar of this force was the god Apep, or Apophis, as the Greeks knew him. Now, every day, once Re had crossed the sky and descended from that noon period and began to descend below the horizon on his solar barge in the west, he would assume his ram form, and he would battle Apep and other demons and monsters alongside members of his court, and in this journey through the underworld, or as the Egyptians knew it, as the Duat. Once he fought these monsters off and completed his journey, he would be reborn every day in the form of Khepri. This Khepri was depicted as a man with a scarab as his head, not a scarab head, just if you see his depiction, it's literally a human who, instead of having a face, has the scarab, the iconic Egyptian scarab. No eyes, nothing else. It's just the scarab head, or just the scarab body. Now, scarabs, and essentially, this man would push the sun disk into the sky while he was sailing on his barge, the same way a scarab pushed dung balls around. Now, scarabs lay their eggs inside these balls, and when the larvae hatch, they eat their way out of a ball, emerging as fully grown beetles. And the Egyptians believed that the scarabs came from nothingness, and so like them, the sun created itself anew every day. So Khepri is a very appropriate, at least to the Egyptians, god to proliferate the sun, or have the sun proliferate itself, essentially. Now, after performing this cycle of birth, life, death, struggle, and rebirth for countless ages, and creating new life during these journeys, or seeing new life grow during these journeys, and again, in some stories, this includes the creation of men, Re was becoming tired and decided that another god should assume his role as king of the earth and defender or protector or, leader of mankind. And to this end, he turned to the Aeneid of Heliopolis to find his successor. The one chosen for this task was Osiris, or as the Egyptians probably call him, is Weser. Now, Osiris was the eldest son of the earth god Geb, and either the goddess Nut, who is the goddess of the star-filled sky, or the cosmos, or the galaxy, whatever you want to call her. And or he was possibly the son of Geb and Epet, who was the goddess of fire. Now, initially, in his earliest days, at least as the way the Egyptians tell the story and the way they depict him with his iconography, though if he was this before, they had their religions combine and evolve more, Osiris was a god of agriculture and shepherds and flocks. And when you see depictions of the mummified Osiris, he is shown holding two items crossed over his chest. These are a shepherd's crook and a grain flail, one used to guide his flocks and the other to prepare grain for use after harvest. Again, flails are used to kind of like beat at the shells of the of the harvested crops and get the shells off so the grains are available to be more easily ground into flour and things like that. And of course, these symbols also become part of all later pharaohs' regalia. There you see them depicted holding them in their tomb carvings. A lot of their sarcophaguses have those crossed across their bodies, in that depiction. Now, Osiris was married to his sister, Isis, or Weset, as the Egyptians called her. And she was possibly a sky goddess in her earliest forms. Probably the sky when it's at its most pleasant, perfect weather for tending animals and crops, not too hot, not too cold. But she was also very wise, and she knew more magic spells than any other god or goddess. As such, she was skilled at healing. She was also beautiful and charming, and as such, these two deities were well loved by all humanity and the other gods. At least that's the way the myth goes. Though, of course, these two are popular all throughout Egyptian history. However, there is one major exception to this universal adoration, and that is their brother Set, or as in the archaic Egyptian form of his name, Sutekh. Now, why Set was upset with Osiris isn't really clear. Later versions of the myths tend to portray Set as just more out-and-out evil. Again, this is that dualism evolving into more good versus evil as opposed to just order and chaos. But in earlier versions of the myth, it does make it seem that Seth may have a legitimate reason to be angry with his brother. Not, of course, to justify what revenge Set takes, but enough to understand why there would be animosity between Set and Osiris. Though Osiris apparently wasn't aware that his brother was pissed at him. Now, some versions say Osiris struck Set unjustly and insulted him for some minor offense, or he had done something wrong. Other versions say that Osiris slept with Set's wife, their youngest sister, Nephthys, or as the Egyptians knew her, Nebethet. Now, Osiris, I think if he slept with his wife, he would probably be aware that Set may be pissed at him, though he may not have known that Set knew. But that's just, that's thinking logically, which, again, as we discussed last time, myths are not always logical. So just keep that in mind. There also isn't a consensus on how Set killed Osiris. The Egyptians don't seem to have liked writing down certain stories, things of like large-scale disasters or things like that. They'll mention them maybe in passing, but they try not to go into details too much. And they may have seen this story, writing it down explicitly, may have been somewhat blasphemous or something like that. It may have only been something that was told, in person live at, maybe a religious festival or something along those lines. That being said, we do have some versions of the story, though the versions we have may not have been the religious versions. They may not have been the exact religious doctrine. They may have been told more for entertainment or something along those lines. Now, the story of the version of the story that I'm most familiar with is that after developing his beef with his brother for whatever reason, Set snuck into Isis's and Osiris's bedchamber, and he measured his brother length and width, and then he had a magnificent wooden chest carved and created, and offered it to anyone who could fit inside it during a banquet that he had held. So he invited everyone over, got everyone rip-roaring drunk, and he brought this chest out. Hey, I'll give this chest to whoever can fit in it perfectly. And of course, everyone tries, and no one works. And then finally, Osiris is like, "All right, I'm gonna get in there." And of course, once Osiris is inside, he fits perfectly. Set then slams the chest shut, and then chains it up, or ties it up, or locks it via magic, whatever. And then he threw the chest into the Nile. Now, Osiris drowns in this, and then what happens next is a little bit up for debate. In some versions, Set immediately takes the box and then chops it up while Osiris is still inside, and then he throws Osiris, who's been cut into 14 pieces, in various places all along the Nile. In other versions, Isis is, of course, panicking that her husband has been trapped in a box and absconded with by Set. She searches for her husband, high and low, and then she finds the chest in the Nile and then pulls it up. So it opens it, and there she sees her husband's body. She's, of course, extremely distraught by this. So she places Osiris, or the chest containing Osiris, nearby out of the water because she has to go prepare for the proper funeral rites. And this included finding her sister Nephthys, who, among her many roles, she was the goddess of the funeral rites, and she was also the goddess of mourning. So she would be a very appropriate person to have at a funeral. Now, while she is away, Set sees that Osiris's remains, and he understands that Isis is going to perform magic, either to usher him into the afterlife or to kind of restore him to life. At that point, Set then decides to chop his brother's body up into 14 pieces. Whatever the exact order of events, Isis and Nephthys get through this, and they recover his remains after searching high and low in bird form. They're birds of prey. They're probably finding the remains and picking them up and bringing them to a central location. Now, later versions of the story also have it so that they don't find Osiris's penis, it having been eaten by a catfish or a crab, depending on the version. But Isis uses her magic to create a new one. At that point, they then perform the funeral rites, and Isis uses her magic to breathe life back into Osiris. But of course, he's been dead for too long, and thus he can't remain in the world of the living, and he has to move on to the Duat, though not before Isis and he conceive a child from this kind of last act of devotion. And she took a form of a bird during this event, and she may have even still been a bird from there searching for Osiris. Who knows? Now, this child is known as Horus, or Hor, or Heru, again, depending on the time and the place. The pronunciation may change. The Horus is the Greek version of the name. Now, Isis flees with her unborn son, and then she goes to the Nile Delta, which is kind of a very wide, spread out place with a lot of life and places to hide. And there she gives birth to Osiris, and then she is occasionally visited by Nephthys, who will occasionally help nurse Horus. But the reason she flees, of course, is because Set would see the child as a challenger for kingship, which, of course, Set usurped after he killed his brother. So he would, of course, kill the child to secure his position on the throne. Now, while in the Delta, Horus is taught, how to live and all this other stuff by Isis and Nephthys while he grows. And, of course, once he comes of age, he went to the Council of Gods and Re, who, of course, king of the gods, king of the heavens, and he challenges Seth's right to rule. Now, Isis is with him, and she argues very eloquently on his behalf. Now, most of the gods are convinced. But Ray is a little more circumspect. He recognized that Horus is strong and filled, with a lot of youthful energy, but, he is still young and not really tested. And he knows Seth's raw power. Seth is essentially a kind of war god, or a god of just violence. And he isn't necessarily convinced that Horus would be a better king, even if he could overcome Set, or if he put Set aside and put Horus in his place. Set could become a very dangerous enemy or rival, not just to Horus, but maybe to the other gods as well. So eventually, though, the gods decided to institute a series of trials and contests between the two. And this makes up a kind of mythic cycle called the Contentions of Horus and Set. And these stories depict various struggles between the two, and these take place over several decades. And you can see depictions of scenes from this in various places in hieroglyphic art. There's a lot of them being depicted as fighting each other as hippos, where Isis accidentally beheads Horus as a hippo, and Horus gets pissed at her, and she quickly reattaches his head, and then Horus then stabs Set with a spear while he's a hippo. But one of the weirder attempts that Set makes to establish dominance over his nephew is by making him submit to him sexually. Now, you're probably starting to understand something about Set at this point. He is a being of pure instinct. He doesn't plan. He doesn't think things through. He acts, and he does so no matter the cost once he has an idea. He lives purely from event to event, from experience to experience. He lives chaos. He is virtually chaos personified. He loves to fight, and he loves to, and what and who he does that with doesn't matter to him in either case. And doing one makes him want to do the other. Hence part of the reason he devises this quote-unquote plan. Now, some versions has him attempt to dominate Horus by pure force in this manner. In this version of the story, Horus is able to trick Set, who's just lost all his reason and logic, to just pure, unadulterated lust. And Horus is able to fool his uncle into aiming at the wrong spot and essentially releasing himself into Horus's hand, which he had, positioned in a way to kind of fool Set. Another version has Horus kind of begrudgingly agree on the condition that Set transfer some of his strength directly to Horus. And Set, again, not thinking with the right head, agrees. Now, Horus submits for some of Set's strength, but he is also weakened because Set's essentially so powerful and potent in all aspects. He's essentially poisonous to most other beings. And this is part of the reason that Set has no children in most cases. There are a couple of instances where, maybe in one area he might have one child, and in another area he might have another child, but in all of those versions, they're the only child of Set. Now, once Set, of course, gets what he's after, essentially, he leaves. He gets bored. He goes to seek another conquest of whatever type. Now, once he's gone, Isis appears, and in the version that Horus is poisoned, she cures him and is able to remove Seth's semen, and then Horus is then able to fully absorb this newfound strength from Set. And then in the first version, Horus just washes his hand in the Nile. Now, whichever version of this tale you hear, they both finish the same way. Isis has Horus relieve himself, and then she smears Set's favorite meal, which is lettuce, with Horus's semen. The next day, Set goes before all the gods and claims that he has bested his nephew sexually and have him submit to him. And he asks them to call out to his seamen to prove that he has conquered Horus. Of course, they do so, and they hear his seamen answer from the Nile or from wherever it was thrown. Then Horus asks them to do the same with his essence. They do so, and his semen answers from Set's stomach. Now, you would think that this might be the end of the story, just because of how crazy it is. But despite this humiliation, Set does not relent. And eventually, this leads kind of into the final bit of the contentions between the two deities. The two gods are tasked with performing a race on a boat made of stone. They each have to create their own boat. Now, Horus it cheats essentially, but he creates a boat that looks so much like stone out of wood, and he just paints it to look like stone. No one is able to tell that it is not a stone boat. And of course, his boat goes much further than Set's does, because Set's sinks fairly soon after starting the test. Now, that might seem a little, kind of a weird way to win, cheating at a contest, and why would the gods, make a contest that no one could win like that? Well, there's certain to be something to be said about like trickster gods or certain gods showcasing both strength and intelligence, which we know Set has very little of the latter, whereas Horus has both in abundance, which is part of the reason he keeps coming out on top in most of these contentions, and again, part of the reason in the end he is appointed the role of king. Now, depending on the part of the region of Egypt or wherever, it might be a little bit different. In some cases, they split the land of Egypt between them, with Upper Egypt going to Horus and the Lower Egypt going to Set. Now, this is not exactly the common version. In most versions, you'll hear that Horus is appointed the king of the Black Land, which again, Kemet, that is Egypt itself, and that includes both Upper and Lower Egypt. And of course, Set, though, despite his loss and his humiliations, he isn't given nothing. Again, I mentioned one version of the story where he is the king of the Lower Egyptians. However, in the more widely told later versions of the story, he is given kingship of the Red Lands, which is the desert on either side of Egypt. So he becomes, in addition to his god, his godhood role as god of chaos and violence and fighting, and in some ways a war god. He is also becomes the god of the Red Land, the god of the desert, and eventually the god of foreigners, peoples coming from outside of Egypt into Egypt itself, which in later periods we'll see Set demonized a lot more than even these earlier versions show. Now, back, of course, Horus, again, he becomes king, and he uses his opportunity as king to make offerings to the spirit of his deceased father, Osiris. And that brings Osiris back to life once again, and as he keeps making these regular funerary offerings, Osiris kept alive. And at this point, you see there's a triad now of the gods. Horus, he is the king that is alive. Isis is the mother of the king, but she's also the wife of the previous king, Osiris, who is now ruler in the underworld. And we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves again, but essentially the pharaohs kind of adopt this as their kind of ritual. the pharaoh who is alive, he is Horus while he's on Earth. When he dies, he goes to his father's realm, and he replaces him as Osiris. And the king's wife becomes the future king's mother. So that is something to keep in mind of as well. Another thing that Set gets as his consolation prize, essentially, is Ra recognizes Set's talent in combat and in fighting. So he has Set accompany him on his journeys in his solar barge to go to the underworld to help Re fend off the attacks of Apep in the underworld and the other demons of the underworld. So, Set, again, in these early days, he's not completely demonized. He is kind of given a supplementary role, despite him being what most people might consider a servant of chaos or disorder or Isfet, as opposed to Horus, who is upholding the natural order of a son succeeding his father, an upholder of Ma'at, which again shows Re's power and wisdom as a king. He understands that some people are suited to roles as opposed to others. So he utilizes Set's need for combat, and he harnesses it in a means for good. And then, of course, he has the foresight to test Horus against Set. He doesn't immediately just say, "Oh, yeah, you're right. You are the rightful heir to your father. Here's the throne." He understands that there's a problem with doing that for someone who is not tested, which kind of again plays into this idea of Re's fitness as a ruler. Now, I don't want to dive too much into this other stuff, but there are theories that this story may have been influenced by kind of the mistier parts of Egyptian history in the actual historical period. It's very probable that these gods existed, at least in some form, prior to the Egyptians writing them down. But it is a possibility that maybe parts of these stories were integrated with history. There is some thought that maybe the contention between Horus and Set contains elements from conflicts between different city-states in Upper Egypt. That they just tacked it on to the story between these two deities. But that's all kind of stuff we'll talk about in the future when we get to the actual historical period. But again, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that some of these elements predate that by a good bit. Another big thing. You see the eye of Horus, which is one of the symbols of the eye. You see that a lot in depictions. That is actually in one of the contentions between Set and Horus. Set gouges out one of Horus's eyes, and that symbol is used to kind of as a ward against evil. Horus is eventually able to regain his eye, but Set is not able to regain his testicle that Horus took, which is his trophy in that fight. But there's also the Eye of Ra, very similar. There's a big overlap between Ra and Horus in later periods, especially. When they're combined, they are Ra. Hor Arakte, I believe, is the combination of the two. Though Re is combined with several gods over different periods. I think it's Re Harakte. Yes, Re Harakte, excuse me, is the combination of the two. But we're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail again when we get back here next season. As for now, I think this is kind of a solid stopping place. If you guys do have any questions or comments, please feel free to drop me a line at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can, of course, direct message me on Twitter/X. And you are also welcome to comment on any of the YouTube videos. I will get there. It may take me a little bit, but I will see it. And of course, I live stream on YouTube a lot during the week, at least Mondays through Thursdays for sure. Occasionally some on the weekends, but yeah. But thank you all for all your support. I hope you've enjoyed. I do apologize. Apparently, people have decided that drag racing down my apartment's parking lot is acceptable, which I don't really care about too much, but the fact that I'm trying to record is very annoying. Hopefully you guys won't get too much of that music, and hopefully it's not copyright. So, but yeah, thank you all, and I hope you have a good one and a good rest of your week whenever you listen to this. Thank you all. Goodbye.